Hi students, in this video we're going to talk a bit about how to evaluate arguments. This is my first in a series of videos about arguments, and we're not going to get into too many of the details here, just sort of introduce you to some of the fundamentals. You'll see a cartoon at the top of your screen. The cartoon says this: penguins are black and white, some old TV shows are black and white, therefore some penguins are old TV shows. Now if I asked you, is this a good argument? Your answer would obviously be no. There's a clear problem with it. If I asked you what's wrong with the argument, it's going to be harder for you to articulate exactly what the flaw is. I think the obvious thing to say is, well, the conclusion is false. It's not true that some penguins are old TV shows. But it's harder to say exactly like what goes wrong with the argument. Why does it fail? And what we're going to learn in this video and following, sort of some terms that we can use to articulate exactly what's wrong with this argument. In particular, what we'll be learning is that the flaw in this argument isn't that the argument has a false premise. And in a way, like, the flaw isn't even that the conclusion's false. When an argument has a false conclusion, it's just a sign that something has gone wrong somewhere else. And so in this case, right, the premises are perfectly true. It's just that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. And so what we're going to say is that this argument's invalid. But we'll learn more about that in a bit. The first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about teaching and learning in general. And the reason I want to talk about this is because I think it's relevant to better understand why we're learning about logic, learning about arguments, how to evaluate them, make them, etc. So we're going to start by looking at just what I'm going to call the standard model of learning. Again, this is not the standard model of learning. You're not going to see this described in your education textbook as the standard model of learning. It's just what I'm going to call the standard model, what we can think of as the standard model. So I call it the standard model because I just think it's a common way of thinking about learning. So the first sort of thing here is that you go into a classroom situation ignorant about a subject area. So maybe this is a history class, a pharmacy class, an engineering class, whatever class you might be in, you often go in thinking like, I don't know anything about this area, I want to learn something. Teachers are going to give you some information about that. Maybe you don't know anything about logic, right? And so you're just sort of looking to me to give you some information about logic. And teachers do that. And then finally you memorize the information. Maybe you practice it. You do something so that it sort of sticks in your head, right? That's the standard model. So the standard model is going to be depicted sort of here. We've got a teacher on the left. They've got some information and they're giving it to you, the student, on the right, and the light bulb turns on and you've learned something. Excellent. The problem with this model is that it doesn't always work. Sometimes you already have beliefs about X, or sometimes you just don't really believe what your teacher is telling you about the subject. So here, you've already got some ideas in your head. Your teacher is going to try and give you this red cube idea, but you've already got the blue sphere idea, and you're just not going to accept what the teacher is telling you. So they try to give you this information, but it just misfires. This is what I feel like. That's me, right? And I feel like in a lot of my classes, oftentimes it's like I'm giving students some information. I'm trying to convince them of something, but they're not buying it. It's just going in one ear and out the other, so to speak. So the question is like, what's going wrong in these situations? And so one thing that's happening, right, is that you've got some pre-existing belief about the subject, and the teacher needs to be able to dislodge that pre-existing belief. They need to give you more evidence, stronger evidence for believing the thing that they're trying to convince you of. So this is especially difficult in something like ethics classes, right? So I like this joke where, you go into a pharmacy class, right? You don't know anything about drugs. Your pharmacy teacher is an expert. But when you come into an ethics class or some other philosophy class, right, you've already got pretty good ideas about what you think about capital punishment or euthanasia or affirmative action, things like that. And you don't need a teacher to tell you what to believe here. And so, in a way, areas or disciplines like ethics, like philosophy more generally, right, are ones where you're going to need a little bit more convincing. We're going to need to be a little bit more careful on how we go about trying to convince you to think something new or change your mind. So what we really need to do, right, is get rid of that belief that's in your head already, and then to make room for the new one. Or, get you so convinced by the new idea, right, that it pushes the old one out. Now, it's important to note that this doesn't just work one way, right? Like, in many cases, I am going to be giving you arguments that from the people we've read, and they're going to be trying to convince you. But we can also learn from each other, right? So there might be another student, right, who maybe I convince you to think that the red cube idea is right, but there's another student with the blue sphere idea, and she convinces us that her blue sphere idea is the right one. So we're all trying to be open-minded. We're all trying to learn here. And the way that we convince each other, the way that we do this, is by using arguments. Sometimes we use other kinds of methods, right? We can appeal to emotions. We can do other things. We can put peer pressure on people. Those are all ways of convincing. But the best way, the way that philosophers think is like the really valuable way, is through careful reasoning. So how do we dislodge these beliefs? As I've already hinted at, right, the way to do it is to make arguments. What is an argument? An argument is a group of statements in which reasons, which we call premises, are offered in support of some further claim. This is called a conclusion. So these definitions are kind of important. Right? We've got an argument. What is that? A group of statements in which reasons, called premises, are offered in support of some further claim, called a conclusion. Premises provide support for conclusions, and the combination of them is an argument. So here's an example of an argument. This diamond figure has 4 sides, and if a figure has 4 sides, then it's a quadrilateral. Therefore, diamond is a quadrilateral. That's an argument. It's got premises, it's got a conclusion. Ideally, we'd like to put arguments into what is called standard form or premise conclusion form. I'll often refer to it as standard form, but maybe that's a little vague. Sometimes students like to call it premise conclusion form. And in that form, what we do is we list the argument's premises above the conclusion, and then we label those things. So we're really like setting it out line by line. So if we take that argument we just looked at and we put it in standard form, it would look like this. So premise 1, the diamond has 4 sides. Premise 2, if a figure has 4 sides, then it's a quadrilateral. Conclusion, therefore, the diamond is a quadrilateral. So the sort of, P1, P2, C1, what P1 means is this is the first premise. P2 means this is the second premise. C1 means this is a conclusion. It's not something that it needs to be assumed or is given as a reason. Rather, it's given as a conclusion. It is supposed to follow from the other things that we've already said. So that notation will be helpful if we're writing a paper, for example, because rather than writing out, you should believe that a diamond has 4 sides because blah, 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 rather you can just simply say, you should believe premise 1 because, and then go on and explain it. Or you should believe premise 2 because, dot, dot, dot. The reason we want to put these arguments in standard form is because it's going to help us or enable us to evaluate the soundness of an argument. So what is a sound argument? How do we evaluate the soundness? So I want to say the best arguments are sound arguments, and we should really only accept a conclusion that someone's giving us on the basis of an argument if that argument is sound. So what do we need in order to be sound for an argument? The argument needs to be valid, and that has this very technical kind of meaning, which I'll give here and then we'll sort of see in future videos. What it means to be valid is just that the argument has premises such that the truth of those premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. That's what it means to be valid. And the argument's got to have true premises. So if we look back at our example, this argument is a sound argument. In some ways, it's easiest to evaluate the premises, the truth of the premises first, right? The diamond has 4 sides. That's true. Premise 2, if a figure has 4 sides, any figure has 4 sides, then it's a quadrilateral. Now maybe I'm being a little vague, right? If a figure has exactly 4 sides, then it's a quadrilateral. That sounds true. So we've got true premises, and the important thing is that if we've got, if this particular figure has 4 sides, and if it's true that all figures that have 4 sides are quadrilaterals, then we can know with certainty that that figure is a quadrilateral. That inference that we can draw, if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, then the conclusion has got to be true. That's what it means to be valid. Here's an argument that's unsound because it's invalid. The diamond has 4 sides. If a figure has 3 sides, then it's a triangle. Therefore, diamond is a quadrilateral. Now, this argument has true premises. Diamond has 4 sides. If a figure has 3 sides, then it's a triangle. Therefore, conclusion, the diamond is a quadrilateral. In fact, all the premises are true. The conclusion's true. But yet, right, there's no connection between the premises and the conclusion. Right? The premises combined don't guarantee the conclusion, and that's the problem. That's what makes it invalid. Here's another argument. This one's also unsound, but it's unsound because it has a false premise. So the diamond has 3 sides. If a figure has 3 sides, then it's a triangle. Therefore, diamond is a triangle. Now, this argument, right, is valid, actually. So the structure is good. The problem here is just that one of the premises is false. So the diamond doesn't have 3 sides, it has 4 sides. And so it's premise 1 in this case that's false that sort of wrecks the argument and makes it unsound. So let's say a little bit more about validity, then we'll say a little bit about truth, and then we'll be done. So whether or not an argument is valid depends on the structure. I've already hinted at this a bit, but here's an argument. If O and U is in Ada, then it's in Ohio. Premise 2, O and U is in Ada. If we know premise 1 and premise 2, and we know we don't need to bring in any outside views about the world, if we only know 2 things, and that's that if O and U is in Ada, then it's in Ohio, and we know that O and U is in Ada, what do we know? We know that O and U is in Ohio. That's a valid argument, because if we know the truth of the premises, we can know the truth of the conclusion for sure. Or in other words, if we assume that the premises are true, then the conclusion follows. Here's another one. If O and U is in Detroit, then it's in Michigan. O and U is in Detroit. Now, here we've got a false premise. Premise 2 is, right? O and U is not in Detroit. Nevertheless, it's a valid argument because if we know that premise 1 is true, if ONU is in Detroit, then it's in Michigan, and we know that premise 2 is true, ONU is in Detroit, then we can infer that ONU is in Michigan. We know that that must be true if the premises are true. The truth of the premises there guarantees the truth of the conclusion. And so that argument's valid as well. Right? Both of these arguments are valid, and they actually take the same valid argument form. They have the same structure. What is that structure? It's this sort of A arrow B, A, therefore B structure. So if we sort of take what this is called, this kind of propositional logic, you don't need to know that, but we've got a proposition here, a statement, an independent clause, an independent thought that can be true or false, right? ONU is in Ada. We've got another proposition here. It is in Ohio. ONU is in Ohio. And so this if-then claim is making a claim about the relationship. ONU's being in Ada guarantees ONU's being in Ohio. Premise 2 says ONU is in Ada. It affirms the antecedent of this conditional. And whenever we have an argument that does this in the premises, we can know what the conclusion is with certainty. That is, if the premises are true, we can know with certainty that ONU is in Ohio as well. This second one has the exact same structure, right? Different propositions in the argument, but the structure is the same. If A, then B, A, therefore B. Now, any argument, no matter what the argument, right, if it is structured in this way, then it's going to be valid. No guarantee that it's sound, right, because it could have a false premise, like this second argument here does have a false premise. But it's got at least one part of what we need for a sound argument. It's got validity, and that's going to be an important key to any argument that you're going to make, that you're going to reconstruct. We always want to make arguments valid. Now, we're going to look, in another video, we're going to talk about valid arguments. And here are some examples of different forms. We've just looked at the form modus ponens on the left here, but there's also an argument form modus tollens, an argument form hypothetical syllogism. Any argument that takes one of these forms is valid. And there are other valid argument forms we're not going to look at as much, but those are three that we will look at. There are also some invalid argument forms. There are, an infinite number of ways to have an invalid argument, but there are some common ones that are often confused for these valid ones. And we want to avoid these, what's called affirming the consequent, A, then B, B, therefore A. As we'll see in a later video, that's invalid. Same with denying the antecedent. These arguments might sound valid, but they actually aren't, so we're going to want to avoid those. Okay, so like I said, the key to having a sound argument, a good argument, an argument where we should accept the truth of the conclusion based on the premises, is one that's valid and has true premises. So let's talk a little bit about what it means for an argument to have true premises. In addition to being valid, a sound argument also needs to have true premises. So when we're evaluating arguments, we've got to check a couple things. One, whether they're valid. Two, whether their premises are true. Determining, again, we're focused here on whether the premises are true, right? We're interested in the truth part. Determining whether an argument's premises are true is pretty straightforward, but determining whether conditional claims are true can be a little bit tricky. So I'm not going to say much about evaluating the truth of what we might call a simple statement, like ONU is in Ada. Whether or not that's true is pretty easy. We just look out into the world, right, and say, is Ohio Northern University in Ada? Say, yep, it is, therefore it's true. Is ONU in Detroit? Nope, no it's not. So that claim's false. But conditional claims are a little bit trickier. And when I talk about a conditional claim, I'm just talking about an if-then claim. So any sort of claim that's suggesting there's a connection between these two propositions, that one guarantees the other. Okay, so consider this conditional. If Trump lives in the White House, then he lives in Washington, D.C. The truth of a conditional claim like this one depends on whether the truth of the claim's antecedent, which is what comes after the if, that's going to be this thing here, Trump lives in the White House, and just look at it on its own. Does the truth of that claim guarantee the truth of the consequent, what comes after then he lives in Washington, D.C.? Does Trump's living in the White House guarantee Trump's living in Washington, D.C.? So here I've sort of color-coded them, right? The antecedent would come after the if, consequent what comes after then. Because Trump's living in the White House does guarantee his living in Washington, D.C., this conditional is true. So if it's true that Trump lives in the White House, let's assume that that's true. Does it guarantee that he lives in Washington, D.C.? Well, yeah, because the White House is in Washington, D.C. Again, here I am really looking out into the world. When we're looking to evaluate the validity, we don't care all that much about, is the world really like this? But when we're evaluating the truth of a premise, we do care about, what is the world actually like? Does Trump's living in the White House guarantee his living in Washington, D.C.? The answer is yes. Here's another one. If Trump lives in San Francisco, then he lives in California. Again, the truth of this conditional depends on whether Trump's living in San Francisco, that is the antecedent, guarantees Trump's living in California, the truth of the consequent. Does the truth of the antecedent guarantee the truth of the consequent? Think about that for a second. Try and figure out, how am I going to answer this question? Is this claim true or not? Here's the answer. The answer is yes. Trump's living in San Francisco would guarantee his living in California. Right? We're not asking, does Trump live in San Francisco? We're asking, if he did, would that guarantee that he lives in California? And the answer is yes. So that conditional is true. Note, right, the fact that Trump doesn't live in San Francisco is irrelevant. We're not asking, is the antecedent true? We're asking, if the antecedent is true, if it were true, then would the consequent have to be true as well? And here the answer to that is yes. One final one. If Trump receives a majority of the national vote, then he will be the president for 4 more years. The truth of this statement depends on whether Trump's receiving a majority of the national vote guarantees his being president for 4 more years. So let's say Trump does receive a majority of the national vote, right? We don't know whether that's true or false, whatever. Doesn't matter. Let's just assume that it's true. Does it guarantee that he's going to be the president for 4 more years? If yes, then it's true. If no, then the conditional is false. Think about it on your own, right? What do you think? Here's the answer. The answer is no. That there's no guarantee. The antecedent doesn't guarantee the consequent, right? Trump's receiving a majority of the national vote doesn't guarantee that he's going to be the president for 4 more years. Why? Well, because who's the president doesn't depend on the national vote. Right? It depends on the electoral votes, votes in the Electoral College. Moreover, right, if Trump receives the majority of the Electoral College votes, then he will be president for 4 more years. I don't think that's even really guaranteed, right? Because a lot of things could happen, right? He could be impeached. He could be killed in office, something along those lines. So there's oftentimes these sort of future predictions, we're often going to get false premises because there's going to be a guarantee of the consequent from the antecedent. All right. So just as sort of a summary, when we go to evaluate a conditional, we just ask, does the truth of the conditional's antecedent guarantee the truth of its consequent? If the answer is yes, then the conditional is true. If the answer is no, then that conditional is false. So that's the important stuff to remember about the truth, evaluating the truth of things. I'm probably not gonna come back and say much more about evaluating the truth of claims until we look at some examples. But I am gonna give a video on validity, and we'll look more at that next time. All right. Hope all is well.